The river smelled like copper and rot, and Dr. Marin Solis knew, before she even dipped the sensor rod into it, that something in it was alive. Not alive the way algae was alive. Not alive the way the microbes she'd cataloged on Veth 4 were alive, passive and slow, filtering nutrients from volcanic slurry. This was alive the way a held breath is alive, coiled, present, waiting for the precise moment to release. She pulled the rod back. The readout blinked amber, then red, then a color the display didn't have a designation for. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the river. It ran through the center of the Kurth lowlands in a wide, lazy curve, dark green in the shallows, black in the deep channel. On both banks, the forest had pulled back. Not cleared, not burned, but simply withdrawn, as if the trees knew better than to lean over this particular water. Alien trees, yes, with their spiraled bark and clusters of six-lobed leaves, but trees that behaved like trees, reaching for light, competing for soil. They did not reach over the Kareth River. They turned away from it. The Vareth had called it the Velnsoth in their language, the blessing waters. They had said this with absolute sincerity, their secondary eyelids half closed in the way Marin had learned to read as reverence. They had brought her here to the deep interior, across 40 kilometers of canopy trail and 3 rope bridges, specifically to show her this. She understood now that she had been brought here to die. Behind her, she could hear Director Olin's boots on the root-packed path. He was not a loud man, but he moved with a kind of confidence that made sound, the way powerful men always seemed to take up more acoustic space than their bodies warranted. She did not turn around. She was still looking at the river. "Well?" he said. "Bioluminescent isotope compound," she said. "Same family as the markers we found in the Vareth sacred groundwater on Sector 9. But concentrated." She paused. "Very concentrated. That's good, isn't it?" His voice was careful, carefully casual. "That depends entirely on what you want it to do." He came to stand beside her. She was aware, peripherally, of the way he looked at the river versus the way he looked at her, which was the same way a man looks at 2 assets on a balance sheet when he has already decided which one he can afford to lose. She had known Tobias Olan for 11 years. He had recommended her for the Karath assignment, personally. He had written 3 of her letters of recommendation. She had once considered him the closest thing she had to a mentor. She was also not stupid, and she had been paying attention for the last 6 weeks, and there were things that did not add up. The way the Vareth's expedition coordinator, Shen Vel, always went quiet when funding was discussed. The way Olan's SATCOM log showed contact bursts at hours when no one else in camp was awake. The way this survey, officially a biome cataloging mission, had quietly redirected its focus from broad ecosystem mapping to the Kareth watershed specifically, and had done so without a formal protocol revision, and had done so at Olan's direction alone. The way the Vareth had looked at her when she first arrived, not with the alien curiosity she had expected from a species encountering humans for only the 3rd time, but with something that resembled pity. "Marin," Olan said. He said her name the way you say the name of something you're about to set down. "It's a weapon," she said. She felt rather than saw him go still. "It's not a sacred river," she continued, her voice level, her eyes still on the water. "It's a delivery mechanism. The Vareth have been seeding it for, I don't know, decades, maybe longer. The isotope compound in the water is bioavailable. It doesn't just irradiate, it bonds. Skin contact, ingestion, doesn't matter. The compound integrates with cellular tissue, and then it broadcasts. Low-frequency biological signal. The Vareth can track anything that's been in this water. Anything." She turned to look at him finally. "Anything they want to find later." Olan's face did the thing it always did when he was recalibrating. A brief, almost imperceptible compression around the eyes, as if he were loading a new expression over the old one. Then it settled into something that might have been admiration if admiration weren't so expensive for men like him. "You're better than I expected," he said. "You didn't bring me here for my fieldwork. I brought you here because you're the only xenobiologist in the Survey Corps who can read a Vareth biochemical structure on site. I needed someone who could confirm the compound's properties without running it through a lab that has a paper trail. And then?" He didn't answer, but his eyes moved briefly to the river. There it was. The Vareth deal was clean from a bureaucratic standpoint. She had pieced it together over the past week from the SATCOM fragments she'd been quietly retrieving from the camp server, fragments Olan thought he'd scrubbed. He had brokered a knowledge exchange agreement with the Vareth Consortium, which was not the friendly indigenous council they'd been represented as in the mission brief, but a multi-system commercial entity with territorial holdings on 6 planets and a history of acquisition methods that the Interstellar Survey Corps had been diplomatically ignoring for 30 years. The Vareth would receive a full xenobiological readout on the Velnsoth compound, human legible synthesis protocols, delivery mechanisms, field application models. In exchange, Olan would receive a very large sum of money and a consulting contract and early retirement somewhere that didn't have extradition agreements with the Survey Corps. What Marin would receive, apparently, was the river. They didn't need her dead, strictly speaking. They needed her not to file a report. A few days in the Velnsoth, not enough to be fatal, just enough to implant the compound, and then she would spend the rest of her life broadcasting a Vareth tracking signal. They would always know where she was. She would never be able to testify without them knowing she was testifying. She would never be able to run without them knowing she was running. She would be effectively neutralized, walking around the galaxy wearing an invisible leash. It was, she had to admit, more elegant than simply killing her. She turned back to the river. The amber light was doing something at the surface, a slow phosphorescent pulse that moved upstream, against the current in a rhythm that she now recognized as biological. Not random chemistry. Intention. "I need to take some additional samples," she said. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression again. "The synthesis report will be incomplete without a full isotope chain," she said. "You want them to have something they can actually use, right? Not just a field reading. You want a deliverable." He was quiet for a moment then. "How long? An hour, maybe 2. He nodded once and walked back up the path. She heard his boots grow distant, and then she was alone with the river. She let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, for approximately 6 weeks. She opened her sample case. She did not take samples. She took inventory. Marin Solis had grown up on a research station in the outer belt of the Terrace system, the daughter of 2 survey biologists who had died, separately, of separate things, by the time she was 20. She had learned, early, that the universe was not hostile exactly. It was simply indifferent, and indifference at scale looks a lot like hostility, and the only sensible response was to know more about your environment than your environment knew about you. She had spent 11 years in the Survey Corps knowing things, quietly, specifically, with the patience of someone who understands that knowledge is only leverage if you hold it until the moment leverage matters. She spread her instruments on the bank. The Velnsoth compound was, as she described to Olan, a bioluminescent isotope bonding agent. What she had not told him, what she had understood from the readout, and from 6 weeks of indirect observation, and from one conversation with a Vareth ecological guide named Shenvel, who had, she now believed, been trying to warn her in the only way he was allowed to, was the compound's secondary property. It was, above a threshold concentration, destabilizing. Not to human tissue. The compound's bond affinity was species-specific. For Vareth physiology, for the particular cellular membrane structure of a Vareth body, the compound above saturation threshold did not track. It disrupted. The low-frequency signal that made a marked human a walking locator beacon would, in a Vareth body at saturation levels, generate a feedback cascade. Biological signal overload. The Vareth had evolved to produce and receive the compound in controlled doses. At the concentrations present in the deep channel of the Velnsoth, where the seeding was densest, where the current moved slowest, and the compound pooled. It was not a blessing. It was a weapon they had pointed at everyone else, including themselves, and had simply been careful never to stand in front of. Careful, and in control of where everyone else was allowed to stand. Marin looked at her instruments. She looked at the river. She looked at the path up the bank where Olan had gone. She thought about the 6 people still in base camp, 4 survey techs, a medic, a logistics officer, none of whom had any idea what this mission actually was, all of whom would be within the blast radius of whatever Olan had agreed to if she didn't do something about it. She thought about Shenvel's face, that expression she'd read as pity, and reconsidered it. It might not have been pity. It might have been the closest a Vareth could get to. "I'm sorry. It might have been. I am not allowed to tell you this, but I am going to stand here and look at you with this expression, and I hope you are as smart as the reports say you are." She picked up her extraction rod and waded into the shallows. The water was cold. That surprised her. She had expected it to feel like something out of a fever dream, charged, electric, wrong. But it was just cold. and it moved around her boots with the ordinary indifference of water, and the bioluminescent pulse moved past her legs like a school of invisible fish. She worked quickly. She wasn't sampling. She was mapping the compound's concentration gradient from bank to channel, the depth at which it peaked, the flow dynamics that kept the highest density seeding in the slow central current. She had done enough fluid dynamics work in her career to model a dispersal event. The question was scale. She had in her sample case 3 canisters of concentrated biological catalyst, standard survey kit, designed for accelerating organic decay in contaminated soil samples. Not designed for this, but chemistry was chemistry, and she had 11 years of field improvisation behind her, and she had been thinking about this problem, or a version of this problem, for about 4 days now. The Vareth compound needed time to migrate. In the current distribution, it moved at roughly the speed of the river, slow, deliberate, colonizing the watershed over decades. Her catalyst would not spread the compound. It would do the opposite. It would collapse the compound's molecular cohesion in the immediate vicinity, triggering the localized feedback cascade in a pulse. Not downstream, where it would dissipate, but in the central pool where the Vareth Consortium's senior staff had been stationed since the expedition arrived, where the Veln Soth curved in its deepest arc and the black water pooled in a natural basin the Vareth called, she had learned, the heart of the blessing. She was not trying to kill anyone. The cascade at this concentration, in this volume of water, would be, she ran the numbers in her head, standing knee-deep in an alien river, cold water pushing at her field pants, disorienting, painful, the biological equivalent of being hit with a sonic pulse. It would incapacitate the Vareth Consortium operatives for long enough for her to get back to base camp, get the survey team into the emergency evac shuttle, and get out. It would also destroy the compound seeding in this section of river, permanently. The Velnsoth would just be a river again. She thought about that for a moment. A river that had been a weapon, quietly, for longer than humans had been in this sector. A river that the trees had learned to turn away from. She uncapped the first canister. Dr. Solis, she turned. Olan was standing at the bank. He had not gone back to camp. He had waited, at the tree line, in the shadow of one of the great spiraled bark giants, and she had not heard him because she had been in the water, which muffled footsteps on the path. And because she had been, she admitted to herself, slightly less careful than she needed to be. He had someone with him, Shenvel. The Vareth ecological guide stood very still in the way Vareth went still when they were receiving the compound signal. Head slightly angled, secondary eyelids engaged. He was reading her, reading the isotope bond from the water she was standing in. She looked at the canister in her hand. She looked at Olan. "Tobias," she said. "Set that down." "No." His expression did the compression thing again. "Marin, you've been an exceptional scientist for 11 years. I don't want. I know what you want." She turned back to the river. She took another step toward the channel. The current picked up here, tugging at her knees. "I've been thinking about this for 4 days. About what you want, what the consortium wants, what I have that they need, and why they need it before the next Survey Corps resupply window." The synthesis report, not the report. She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "Me, I'm the report. I've already run the full analysis. It's in my head. Shenvel just confirmed it." She nodded toward the Vareth. "He's been reading me since I got in the water, hasn't he? Checking what I know. Because that's what the compound does to a marked subject. It broadcasts cognitive biochemical state for anyone calibrated to receive it." Olan said nothing, which was in its way a confirmation. "So you need me marked, not dead. Marked, mobile, and delivering." She turned fully to face them now, the current cold against her legs, the canister in her hand. "Here's my problem with that plan." She dropped the first canister into the channel. She had 3 seconds, she estimated, before it opened. In those 3 seconds, she crossed the remaining distance to the deep current in 2 strides. The bottom dropped away, and she was swimming, suddenly, the cold shocking the air out of her lungs, and she got her hand on the submerged root of a fallen tree on the far bank and held on. The canister opened. The Velnsoth went white, not the bioluminescent amber red she had watched pulse upstream. White, total, sourceless, as if the river itself had been exposed to light from inside. She felt it through the water, a deep, thrumming vibration that she recognized, technically, as the cascade she had predicted, and that she felt, practically, as every nerve in her body screaming at once and then going very quiet. She was not Vareth. The feedback had no target in her biology. It moved through her like weather, massive, undirected, devastating to something that she did not have. She held onto the root. The current was nothing now compared to the pulse moving through the water. She pressed her face against the bank and breathed through her teeth and waited. From across the river, through the white, she heard Shenvel make a sound she had never heard a Verith make before. She heard Olin say, very clearly, What is? And then she heard him hit the ground. The white lasted 11 seconds. She counted them. Then it passed downstream, dispersing, weakening, and the river was dark green and black again, and cold and moving. She pulled herself up the bank. Her hands were shaking, but they were working. She was soaked to the skin and covered in black river silt, and she had lost one of her boots to the current, but she was on her feet. On the far bank, Olin was on his hands and knees, his satcom lying 3 feet away from him in the dirt. The secondary eyelids of every Verith she could see, Shenvel, 2 consortium operatives who had been in the shallows upstream, were fully closed. The feedback had hit them like a wall. They were alive. They were not functional. Marin stood at the river's edge, silt to her knees, 1 boot on and 1 boot gone, and looked at it. It was just a river now. She picked up a stick from the bank and rode in the soft mud above the waterline. Velnsoth compound neutralized. Sector 7 through 12. Full survey follows. M. Solus, ISC. Then she took a picture of it with her field recorder, because she was a scientist. And documentation was documentation, even when your hands were shaking. Then she started walking. Base camp was 4 kilometers through the Kareth canopy, and she made it in a little over an hour, barefoot on one side, moving fast and then faster when she heard the camp's emergency frequency had been opened, which meant someone there had a receiver and had picked up the pulse signature from the river. She came through the camp perimeter at a run and nearly collided with Technician Reyes, who was coming out of the equipment shelter with an emergency beacon in one hand and an expression of extreme professional alarm. Dr. Solis, Reyes said, Your boot, where's the evac shuttle? On standby. Dr. Olin hadn't authorized. I'm authorizing it. She stopped, took 1 breath. She had been trained long ago by a woman who'd run 2 planetary evacuations. That panic was only dangerous when it was contagious, and the only treatment was to slow down once completely and then continue at speed. Listen to me, Reyes. Where is everyone? Med Bay, equipment shelter, cook shelter. We felt the pulse, we thought. Get them to the shuttle. Everything mission critical only. We have maybe 40 minutes before the consortium operatives are functional again, and I'd like to be outside this atmosphere before that. Reyes stared at her. Reyes was 26, and this was her second field assignment. Marin watched her do something in her face that was very close to the same thing Marin had done standing in the river. A moment of reckoning, a weight set down, a choice made. Then Reyes said, "Copy that," and turned and shouted a name into the equipment shelter and moved. Marin went to the base camp server. She had 20 minutes before anyone would need her for boarding. She sat down at the terminal in the command shelter. Still wet, still 1 boot short, and she wrote the most important report of her career. She was very thorough. She had always been very thorough. She put in the compound analysis, the concentration mapping, the dispersal event, Olin's SATCOM logs, the consortium's commercial registration details, the full synthesis chain of the Velnsoth isotope seeding. She attached everything from her field recorder. She addressed the report to the ISC Director General, her own department head, the Interstellar Commerce Oversight Bureau, and 3 xenobiology journals, whose editors she trusted on the grounds that public record was harder to suppress than internal filing. She sent it before the shuttle was finished boarding. Then she went to the shuttle. Reyes had gotten everyone moving. 5 people, most of them with their field bags half-packed, clustered at the shuttle ramp, with the expression shared by people who have been told there is not time to ask questions, but have approximately 400 questions. The medic, Dr. Ferlin, had a portable scanner in his hand and was pointing it at Marin with the look of a man who had picked up about 14 concerning biometric readings and was not sure where to start. "I'm fine," she said. "Your core temperature is, I know." She boarded. "Get us in the air, Reyes." Reyes was already in the pilot seat. The shuttle lifted with the stomach-dropping efficiency of an engine not yet warmed up, which Marin had always found unpleasant and had never before found as close to beautiful as she found it now. The way the Kareth canopy dropped away below them, the great spiraled trees and their 6-lobed leaves, the wide flat river system threading silver through the green and black, the Velnsoth dark and unremarkable from altitude, just water. "Where are we going?" Reyes asked. Relay station on the outer ring. I've filed a distress marker. There should be a Survey Corps response vessel within 24 hours. She paused. Make sure you log the flight path. Everything on record. Reyes nodded. Her hands on the controls were steady. Marin looked out the viewport. The Kareth lowlands spread below them, enormous and alien and still. From this height, beautiful in the way that genuinely dangerous is always briefly beautiful when you are no longer inside it. She thought about Shenvel's expression, about what it had been trying to say, and what she had almost missed. Ferlin appeared at her elbow with a thermal blanket and pressed it on her with the wordless authority of a medic who has decided that asking permission is a formality he is skipping. Thank you, she said. You want to tell me what happened down there? She thought about it for a moment, not whether to tell him. She was going to tell everyone, loudly in writing, repeatedly, but how to begin. The river, she said finally. Someone built a weapon into it. A long time ago. Maybe before anyone was paying attention to this sector. They were patient about it. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. And then we showed up. Ferlin was quiet for a moment. Then, how'd you stop it? I waded in. He looked at her. There was a secondary property in the compound, she said. They'd built the weapon in a specific direction. It only pointed one way. She watched the forest below them. I turned it around. He sat down in the seat across from her, which she took as permission to stop summarizing, and she was glad of it. Talking about it made it orderly, and orderly was not what it had felt like. What it had felt like was cold water and a route she had found by luck, and 11 seconds of white, and Olan on his hands and knees in the dirt, and the river dark again after. She had not been braver than she was afraid. She had been afraid for 6 weeks, and she had used it. The way you use a cold river, not to feel nothing, but to stay awake, to keep your hands moving. The relay station appeared on Reyes's navigation screen as a yellow marker. 30 minutes out, the Survey Corps response vessel, ISC Ferris, reached their position 22 hours and 14 minutes after Maren's distress marker went out. It carried, in addition to its standard crew, a legal officer, a senior investigation officer named Commander Liat Verosas, and, which Maren had not expected but perhaps should have, a representative from the Interstellar Commerce Oversight Bureau who had been, it became clear, already looking at the Vareth Consortium. Varos was a compact woman of about 50 who wore her field uniform like she'd been born in it, and who shook Maren's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been briefed extensively and had a great many follow-up questions. Your report came in complete, Varos said. They were in the Ferris's briefing room, which smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee, which I appreciate. Some people, in your situation, go to pieces. I had 20 minutes and a stable connection, Maren said. It seemed irresponsible not to. Varos looked at her for a moment with an expression Maren couldn't immediately read. Then she said, Director Olan and the consortium operatives were extracted by the local Vareth civil authority. Apparently, the consortium faction doesn't have universal support even among the Vareth themselves. That tracks with what you sent us about Shenvel. She opened a file. Olan will be charged under Corps Charter. The consortium's survey access to Kareth is suspended pending the ECOB investigation, which was already underway, and which your documentation has. She paused, looking for the right word, significantly accelerated. Good. The Velnsoth compound. Varos closed the file. Your dispersal event neutralized the seeding from the main pool through sectors 7 to 12. The compound is still present in trace amounts in the upper tributary system. I only had 3 canisters, Maren said. We know. We're sending a remediation team. Varos paused again. The Vareth Civil Authority, the faction not affiliated with the consortium, is calling it the most significant ecological intervention in the Kareth watershed in recorded history. They want to know if you'd be willing to consult. Maren thought about the trees that had learned to turn away from the river. The long patience of something that had been wrong for so long it looked like landscape. Yes, she said. I'll consult. Varos nodded. She stood, and Maren stood, and they shook hands again. One more thing, Varos said. She had a way of delivering addenda that made them feel like the actual subject of the conversation. Your field report notes that you entered the river knowing the compound would integrate with your tissue. I knew it would. I also knew I wasn't Vareth, so the feedback cascade wouldn't have a target. But the compound is still in your system. Traces. The ICOB medical team will want to assess. I assumed. You're not concerned. Maren thought about it. She thought about standing in the cold current, the bioluminescent pulse moving past her boots like water. That was thinking, the canister in her hand. The route she'd found in the dark by feel. "I've been broadcasting a Vareth tracking signal for the last 24 hours, she said. "Nothing's come to find me." She looked at Veros steadily. "I think they know where I am. I think they've decided I'm not the problem they thought I was." She paused. "Which is fine. I've always found it useful to be underestimated." Varos considered this for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved fractionally, in a way that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "I'll note that in the file," she said. The remediation team was on site within a week. Marin went back with them. She stood at the bank of the Velnsoth on a gray morning, with the mist still in the canopy, and watched the team's equipment move through the shallows, mapping, measuring, beginning the slow work of finishing what she had started, with 3 canisters and bad odds. Furlan was there, on medical standby, still pointing his scanner at her intermittently with the expression of a man who had not entirely moved on from 14 concerning biometric readings. Reyes was there too, which Marin had not expected. She had filed for field transfer to the remediation team, she said. She said, some follow-up questions. Marin stood at the water's edge and looked at the river. It was just a river. The pulse was gone. The deep biological rhythm she had watched move upstream against the current. Intention disguised as chemistry, patient and slow and older than the human presence in this sector by a long margin. The water was green in the shallows and dark in the channel, and the trees on both banks had, in the week since the dispersal event, begun to do something that none of them had documented before in the Kareth watershed. They were leaning toward the water, not far, slowly, the way plants move when a threat has been removed. And they are cautiously, incrementally remembering what they were doing before they learned to be afraid. Marin watched this for a while. Then she opened her field recorder and started writing notes because she was a scientist, and the trees leaning toward the river was data. And data was what you built the next thing out of. Reyes came to stand beside her. She looked at the trees for a moment. "Will they make it all the way back?" she asked. "To the water?" "Eventually," Marin said. "It'll take time. They've been pointed the other way for a long time." She looked at a particular tree, large, spiraled, with one branch that had grown in a pronounced curve away from the river, decades of growth decision made permanent in wood. "Some of them have been growing wrong for so long they can't fully correct, but they can grow forward from here." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Then you knew, didn't you, when you waded in? You knew the compound would mark you?"
"Yes. You weren't afraid?"
Marin thought about the honest answer. She looked at the tree with the curved branch. She looked at the cold, dark channel where the current still moved, just water now, faithful to gravity, and nothing else. "I was afraid for 6 weeks," she said. "By the time I was in the river, the afraid part was done." She went back to her notes. The trees continued their slow lean, the mist lifted, incrementally, from the canopy. Down in the shallows, a remediation tech called out a reading, and someone else called back an acknowledgement, and the small human noises of people doing careful work in a wild place moved through the air above the Velnsoth, which was, after a very long time, just a river again, and was, for the first time in a very long time, beginning to be safe. Not fixed, not finished, but turned finally in the right direction. That was enough to start with. Marin had always known the difference between a problem solved and a problem redirected, and she had always found the second kind more honest, because it put the work where it belonged, in the hands of everyone still standing at the bank, still looking at the water, still deciding what to do next. She pressed record on her field notes. She began at the beginning, the way you always do when the story isn't over yet. The river smelled like rain now. That was new. That was good. She wrote it down.